So this year's stories in the Project Censored book and online seem to be quite a bit about law enforcement, the prison industrial complex, and climate issues, which really, if you look at that, the crackdown on freedoms, human rights, militarized police, and impending climate catastrophes, these are essentially all the issues that are legitimately tearing us apart right now. How is it that we continue to live all of these atrocities without ever hearing or glimpsing them on the media?
Well, it's interesting. Thanks, by the way, Eleanor, for having me on to talk about media and, well, censorship, really. What you just described is these are key issues that define the struggles of our times, of our day. And certainly in the United States, anybody that has been paying a whit of attention realizes that there's not only do we have the largest, basically police state, largest prison system, largest prison population in the freest country in the world, and the beacon for global democracy, with a couple million people in prison, that many of whom are there for nonviolent drug offenses, many of whom have been railroaded in because of specifically, racist and classist drug laws over the years, predating the Nixon administration. Certainly, the Reagan administration did a lot to pile onto that with private prisons. But I think you're right about the core of this is that we don't really have a free press that goes to the root of these struggles, to the root of these problems. And when we do see corporate media cover these kinds of issues, it's very sensationalistic, it's very superficial, and it also does a lot of victim blaming. And we don't really get to see the consequences of the Pentagon 1033 programs and the paramilitarization of the police. We don't get to see the lack of transparency in police unions, for example. Police unions are extraordinarily powerful political organizations within the municipalities that they exist, and they're protecting their interests, and their interests are usually not necessarily in the public interests. And so a lot of the stories that we do over the years really kind of look at that issue, whether it's Black Lives Matter, which is really a social justice movement, not only about racism but about police state oppression. And we don't just cover the problems of those issues, even though, going back with Project Censored, we were founded in 1976. In 1977, our top story was on the myth of Black progress coming out of the civil rights movement. And last year in our 40th anniversary book, we covered the Black Lives Matter movement, saying what has changed and what hasn't. Just the other day was the anniversary for can't believe I'm blanking. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Hampton. I was just talking about him the other day because I was talking about the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and the 10-point program. And I was just reading it in a class, and I said, what's so radical about the proposal of asking not to be murdered in your homes and treated like human beings in a purportedly free society with equal opportunity? And that was 50 years ago. That's we're going on now. So I think that we have the free press angle on this, and the failure of journalism on this is that we have a system in the United States. It's a for-profit private system of information dissemination, not that different than the prison system, for example. That's for profit also in many cases. And we don't have a lot of intrepid journalists going and covering these stories because of the conflicts of interest, and because of long-standing historical inertia. Right. That or the idea, the faux idea that, well, we had a civil rights movement, so we fixed those problems. And now we've had an African-American president. So we live in a post-racial society. Ask yourself how we have the rise of one of the most significant racially based social justice movements in Black Lives Matter during the Barack Obama presidency. And that should show you that we're not a post-racial society. We're a society that's in denial. We're a society that's awash in a sea of information with digital natives in a digital age of information where people have a paucity of understanding and lack critical thinking skills to dissect, deconstruct that information and propaganda. We have journalists that are afraid to ask tough questions because of who pays their paycheck, and advertisers and owners are basically ruling in that industry. And we don't have enough people paying attention to independent alternative truth tellers because there's no real profit in it. So at Project Censored, we try to give a platform for those kinds of stories that have been published. And like you mentioned, a lot of those stories are about police violence, police neglect, about prisons, a lack of social justice concerns. But we don't just focus on the problems. As you know, we also look at solutions. And one of our stories in the latest Censored book, 2018, Press Freedoms in a Post-Truth World, was on 8 ways this was published by Yes Magazine and on Mike and other places. It's about what are ways that we could, as a community, work to have policing that is less invasive, that is less violent, that is less punitive. And this lists 8 things that you can do and you can push in your community to have less violent interactions with police. You don't need armed, paramilitarists at intersections to monitor jaywalking, for example. And these people are the classic example of being all trained as hammers. And when you're a hammer, every problem is a nail. And there's such overkill going. I mean that literally and figuratively, unfortunately, that we really need people writing about these kinds of reforms and writing about the injustices that go on, so that people can focus their attention on how to make them better. And there are people that are focusing on making them better. But one thing our corporate press also failed to do, they don't only fail to look at those problems seriously in historical context, they fail to shine a light on the people that are actually doing anything to change them.
Absolutely. And I think, speaking of this idea of the post-truth and anti-intellectual era, studies continuously show that people don't have, the vast majority of the country does not have absolute faith in the corporate media, and yet there's like sort of this limbo or purgatory where not a lot of people have faith in alternative media, or they don't know about alternative media. What does that look like, particularly now that we're in this post-truth where everyone's entitled to their own facts?
Yeah, that's an interesting. It's a nice platform to quote the late Daniel Patrick Moynihan from New York, who said, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but no one's entitled to their own facts. Or a Mark Twain favorite quip of mine is, "Get your facts first, then you can distort them as much as you please." Um, but at least we'd be dealing with facts, right? And part of this post-truth world or era, as Oxford Dictionary ushered in last year, right? Sort of riffing on Colbert's truthiness idea before he sold out to the late night corporate press. There is this trend that has been exacerbated by social media algorithms in particular, that feeds our confirmation bias. That a number of years ago in the Censored books, we do junk food news and news abuse chapters every year in the book that really deconstruct the problems of propaganda in news media, corporatization of education, the dumbing down, if you will, as you were alluding. Right. And I mean, granted, there's been people writing about this dating back ages, whether it was H.L. Mencken, riffing on the idiocy of the American public and what he called the bourgeoisie, or Hofstadter in the 60s, Neil Postman in the 1980s, amusing ourselves to death. Certainly Chris Hedges, Henry Giroux. There's been so many in the line of critics, Susan Jacoby. There's a real anti-intellectual strain in United States culture, and the corporatization and privatization of education and the No Child Left Behind model of regurgitation and bubble tests, coupled with sort of spoon feeding and sensationalist infotainment through corporate media, has really acted to create a less critical society. As you mentioned, also a disgruntled one, where increasingly people in the United States don't trust corporate media, but they're often too ill-informed or not critically media literate enough to know where else to go to get information, which is what we do at Project Censored. Is we don't teach people what to think. We don't tell people what to think. We try to teach people how to think critically, how to be critical media consumers, and how to create a climate of information veracity where you can find out what is a fact and what is not, and then debate and argue about those things. But again, I think as you were kind of going on about how you framed this, what we're trying to do in this post-truth world, and we riff on that because Andy Roth and I, who put the book together again this year, out by Seven Stories Press, we don't really live in a post-truth world, do we? Or do we want that? We certainly don't want that. And frankly, we don't think that we do. We do live in a world where we can objectively assess empirical facts. The fact that our institutions are failing to do so because of regulatory capture or conflicts of interest or ownership advertising bias or propaganda model issues, that just needs to be called out and deconstructed. We don't need to accept that this is the case. We need to fight against that. And one of the ways we do that at the project, you can learn more at projectcensored.org, is through education. And I don't mean, the indoctrinated kind of propaganda as higher education. I mean simply giving people the tools to think critically and independently on their own. And Rabindranath Tagore, the great Indian poet, once wrote that truth comes as a conqueror only to those who have lost the art of receiving it as a guest. And Andy Roth and I write in the book this year in the introduction, we have not lost the art of receiving it as a guest. If we can control our confirmation bias, we can get a grip on our motivated reasoning and inferred justification, and we can demand that we have factual reported news. We can demand that we not only demand that we get multiple perspectives and seek out media that do that, but we can do what you're doing, Eleanor. We can be the media. We can create media in our own forums and we can share it in our own networks because the corporate media is not going really to be reformed. It's actually more and more irrelevant other than a propaganda organ of the corporate state, which is interesting that New York Times or other places don't have to register as foreign agents, but over at RT, they somehow do. APAC doesn't. RT does. It's a glaring double standard that shows how far recessed we are into a propaganda mindset in our own media systems.
And in that same vein, this issue of PR firms that literally control our media, and there was information on this about this on Project Censored. Of course, what our media does is manufacture consent, and what we try to do is manufacture dissent. But I think people often don't realize how like intense and vast that propaganda machine is that manufactures consent via the media. And I know it could take, days to get into this, but there are behemoths behind, like hundreds of millions of dollars, PR firms behind
Yes.
our media that create news stories that are then regurgitated by so-called journalists. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And these stories, by the way, you can find at projectcensored.org. A lot of our chapters of our books aren't necessarily online, but some of the stories are. One of our top stories from this past year, in fact, was about how the Pentagon was paying PR firms to create fake Al Qaeda videos in the United Kingdom. Hill and Knowlton, the Rendon Group. Peter Phillips has a chapter in our Censored 2017 book, the 40th anniversary book, looking at the three major public relations firms, Omnicom, et cetera. Companies, by the way, that most people have never heard of, right? At least when we talk about corporate media, you can see people saying like, well, yeah, there's News Corp and Disney and I think Viacom's in there. People have at least some awareness, I think, of corporate media these days, maybe more so than not, given that we're now on the 30th anniversary of the propaganda model. By the way, Ed Herman gave us a great chapter in the new book on the propaganda model at 30 that looks at ownership, advertising. The classic book from 1988 was Manufacturing Consent, based on Eddie Bernays' language used after World War I that talked about how this is how to manage modern democracies. Chomsky and Herman in 1988 said, no, this is how you control public opinion and control democracy, which is not a good thing. But at any rate, this business with PR firms is incredibly insidious because they're paid from clients, and clients are client states, intelligence agencies, corporations, individuals, political candidates, companies that sell toothpaste. They all hire the same firms to sell their product, whether it's an ideology or a thing or a candidate or an election or a war, right? Hill and Knowlton, for example, was the company that was hired to coach the young daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in 1990, going into 1991 with the first Gulf War, to coach her how to lie to Congress about how babies were allegedly being thrown out of incubators as Iraq invaded that country. Uh, did not happen. It goes back to the Bernays days of World War I, when the Committee on Public Information claimed that the Germans were throwing Belgian babies, ripping the arms off of Belgian babies. I mean, they don't even make new stuff up; they just recycle old stuff. But these lies are incredibly powerful because they appeal to people's emotions. And public relations firms, that's what they do. They're designed to sell a product or an idea, and they know how to do that fallaciously. They know how to do it by appealing to emotions. They know how to do it by attacking, dividing, conquering, distracting, distorting, obfuscating. The tactics are well known. I teach entire college courses on this. You said we could talk about it for hours, and yes, you're correct. Books have been written about it. But it's important to really just try to get that across to people because in this case, again, not telling people what to believe, but trying to give people a basic heads up that you are being manipulated. At least the efforts are afoot to manipulate you. Hill and Knowlton, again, one of the big companies that did that. Also one of the ones that did Jessica Lynch. How they said, oh, poor Jessica Lynch, this blonde girl that was captured by the Iraqis and almost killed in the second Iraqi invasion. Didn't happen. She was in an accident. She was rescued by Iraqi doctors. And then they had a film crew go to set up to, quote, rescue her. And then the Marines almost killed people accidentally while they were rescuing her for the cameras. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous. Just like the toppling of the statue of Saddam Hussein in 2003. It was a complete PR stunt set up. People were brought in, cameras were brought in. I mean, this stuff is going on writ large. The Rendon Group, John Rendon, is called the man who sold the war. A rare expose of him in the Rolling Stone a number of years, believe it or not, showed how he helped peddle weapons of mass destruction propaganda. And, Rendon is a self-professed liberal. So it isn't just that these are right-wing people. This is a thing. It's a business thing. Public relations is a massive profiteering industry to manufacture consent. Capitalism is a driving force behind this because there are mass profits in war. War is a racket, as Smedley Butler said in 1935, is the second most decorated Marine in U.S. history. Still is. And the way that we can continue that racket and the military-industrial complex boondoggles from the taxpayers is to divide, conquer, propagandize, and ritually lie to the public, especially in a permanently fear-based society that has been created after 9/11.
Yeah, and that post-truth society and the anti-intellectual side, where there's not that intellectual curiosity to question and to demand proof of things, but just sort of accept it like, oh, I guess that happened. I guess we should go to war then.
Yeah.
So talk about, and furthermore, not just in terms of PR, but this idea of media collusion, like the New York Times running story by the Democrats in a recent expose that shows that LA Times colluded with the CIA in showing them drafts, but also asking the Times how they might help asking the CIA how they might help spin stories like overseas drone strikes. So this isn't just like PR firms spinning this, it's actual papers and journalists, again, like going to government officials and saying, hey, is this okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the Central Intelligence Agency. I mentioned the Pentagon earlier, but there are numerous intel agencies in the United States and around the world that actively engage in this practice. In the United States, we have the free press illusion that's protected by the First Amendment. And I don't mean to be flippant about that. There clearly are countries in the world that don't even have pretense to a free press. But the one dangerous thing about that, or I would say maybe insidious thing about that in the United States, is that because we have a predisposition that a free press actually exists, people don't necessarily ask the kind of questions that would demonstrate whether or not that's true. And in the case of the CIA, we've had deep state manipulation of media dating way back, whether it was the FBI created long before the Central Intelligence Agency or the CIA created in 1947 that got hot to trot on controlling media with Allen Dulles and the Dulles brothers. This has been documented in David Talbot's books, Devil's Chessboard. It's certainly been the topic in the Censored books. Brian Covert, a journalist with us, wrote an entire book an entire chapter on CIA media, real fake news, right? Is what it is. About how the Central Intelligence Agency long worked with journalists and newspapers and news outlets, and then subsequently television and now internet and social media. There's a lot of CIA startup money that goes into social media through Peter Thiel, Facebook, all these kinds of things. It's not really that much different. It's just gotten more sophisticated and harder possibly to track. But you're right. We need to go back and look. It isn't just public relations firms. It's literally arms of our own government with taxpayer money and black budgets that go in to manipulate information. There's something at the Central Intelligence Agency also called the Entertainment Liaison Office that works very closely with Hollywood to manufacture scripts. Most of the Marvel films are CIA scripts. Again, you say this stuff to people and they start saying, that sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory. Another term hatched by the CIA after the Warren Commission report in the 1960s to demonize people that are critical thinkers, asking obvious questions about the cover-up the Warren Commission was. And in fact, the Congress even decided that was true in and of itself by the time 1979 came out after the Church Committee hearings, that in fact they said the Kennedy assassination was part of a conspiracy. And that's Congress talking. That's not Mark Lane or Peter Dale Scott, even though they said the same things. But it's really difficult to get, everyday Americans to the table to understand that this is a thing. It's not just a thing. It's a freaking industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar effort. It's a taxpayer boondoggle where we're paying to be misinformed. It goes all the way up through where the Pentagon is using taxpayer money to use the NFL as a political prop for militarization and jingoism. And yet we hear people saying we can't politicize the NFL with Colin Kaepernick taking the knee for social justice. Well, then stop propagandizing it for jingoism and CTE injuries and having people bash each other's skulls like cavemen. No offense to people that are troglodytes. But this is a real serious problem. It's the problem that we lack critical media literacy, we lack critical education, critical pedagogy that Henry Giroux talks about so much, that Paulo Freire talked so much about decades ago. So education coupled with media issues, this is where we're going to really help change that kind of landscape. There's no quick fix. Facebook thinks you're going to scale to the problem with fact checkers. That's impossible. Snopes has its own internal problems and can never scale to the difficulties of so-called fake news or propaganda, since fake news isn't new. We've had legislative efforts in our anti-intellectual culture to try to ban fake news. That's not going to go. That's part of the problem. What we really need is critical media literacy education, and we need crowd-contested media like my friends over at Tribeworthy.com, right? Where it's like a Rotten Tomatoes or Yelp for news sources. So you can build trust in a community of news consumers, people that understand and read news, so that you don't have to rely on elite members of our society to tell us what news is and is not, where we have a government that decides this is foreign agent propaganda and this is actually news. Really? The Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, that got a $600 million contract with the CIA after he bought the Post, which, as you mentioned, if you go back and read the Brian Covert piece, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they were long working in collusion with the Central Intelligence Agency to peddle Cold War propaganda. This is historical fact. These are not fictions. These are not theories. These are realities. We just, however, live in a society that we're really not given the opportunity to discuss these in public platforms, a degree to which that when people like you or I or others, if we ever do get a platform in these places, we look like lunatics. Well, that's all part of the strategy of the conspiracy theorist label, is to suppress dissent. And you mentioned what one of the things that independent journalists ought to be doing is not manufacturing consent, it's creating dissent with facts and telling people what's really going on, was what George Selby said in the 20th century, is what the role of journalism actually is.
Yeah, and it's that idea of like demonizing, like folk devils, like you create a scapegoat for like the conspiracy theorists, and it's like, oh, everything from GMOs to vaccines to the media being out to propagandize you is ridiculous. Just sit in front of the television and watch Fox News, and that's all you need to know. Also so ironic that the anti-intellectual government is the one trying to make laws about intellectual information, such as news, of course. But with that, like these platforms, I mean, we live in a digital world. Regardless of what happens with net neutrality, there will be ways for people to access the internet in some way. And the issue of behemoths like Facebook and Google cracking down on alternative news sites as fake news, using people like Snopes that are, Democrat centrists to crack down on progressive sites is very convenient. How has this affected Project Censored?
Well, that's a great question. And in our Censored 2018 book, we were honored to have a chapter, the last published work, I believe, of Edward Herman, who is updating the propaganda model in the Project Censored book that actually talks about Facebook, Google, Microsoft, algorithms, bots. And we write about that in the book. Some of the stories are in our top censored stories. In our Project Censored radio show not long ago, we interviewed Rob Williams, who's a media professor and historian. He also had worked with Action Coalition for Media Education, another media literacy education organization. And he writes he's writing another piece for us for January, updating the propaganda model for the 21st century. So you're right, Eleanor. The model is still valid, but we need to update it for the digital era. And we need to be looking at how Eric Schmidt at Google admitted that they are stymieing independent news media. They're stymieing what they call fake news, what they call propaganda, this neo-Cold War, kind of ethos about Russian propaganda and Russia, demonization of Russia. Look, I'm not saying Putin is some kind of stellar character here, and I'm not suggesting Russia isn't an oligarchy in its own right, kind of like the United States, but different. But what I am saying is that this kind of scapegoating, that's the perfect word that you used, this kind of scapegoating is designed to shut down critical thinking. This kind of suppression of alternative and different viewpoints and questioning is part of an anti-intellectual trend that not only believes that people don't have a right to hear information, but it also cynically believes that people are too stupid and ignorant to process it. Or perhaps the flip side of that is that maybe the established order doesn't believe we're too stupid and ignorant. Maybe they, in fact, know that when we're presented with factual information, we may, in fact, start pay more attention. We may, in fact, start wondering why the DNC thinks it can rig its own primaries. We may wonder why we have elections that take place in cyberspace that are imminently hackable and have been shown to have been done so. Rather than have shifting goalposts of Russia tipping the election or Russia hacking this or now Russia had ads on Facebook, ooh, yeah. Well, so who had ads in the New York Times? Who had ads on CNN? You appropriately singled out Fox moments ago for the chicanery that passes as journalism over there. But CNN is not much different. MSNBC is not much different. Meanwhile, all the while there's this massive, tax shift, this major giveaway to the rich going on. There's all kinds of further deregulation happening, wholesale giveaways of public lands. Meanwhile, at Rachel Maddow's house, it's all Russia all the time. That's not journalism. That's propaganda. And I tell you that the way that it's going with search engines, and I see this in social media, I see rather well-educated, well-meaning liberal progressive intellectuals or conservative intellectuals. And I don't mean necessarily people at Breitbart or Fox. I mean more old school people that have conservative viewpoints, but weren't born yesterday. I see a dangerous trend of them saying like, well, Google's not suppressing information, and that's part of the information future. And Bill Gates, and Apple, they're on our side because they want to protect net neutrality. You got to really read between the lines there and look behind the scenes. Those companies will go the way the wind blows. When Pi and the net neutrality issue is facing us again, Comcast quietly removed their public statements about supporting net neutrality. Because, look, we all know these big behemoths, they're stoked to have the pay-to-play highway and suppress information so that they don't have to necessarily do it insidiously or nefariously or secretly. They can just come right out and do it and call it free markets. And they can just say that, hey, this is how the marketplace of ideas functions. That's how propaganda functions. That's how the death of democracy occurs. But that's certainly not a free press system. And we can't really trust that these major companies are going to be on the side of the people on issues like net neutrality while they're simultaneously admitting that they're spiking particularly left progressive sites that have political economic analysis of our established order and certainly critiques of capitalism.
Right, and these are the same companies that, lobbied to make sure that intellectual property and copyright were incredibly strict in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and will do so for the renegotiations of NAFTA. So it's like, well, sometimes they're the good guys, but that's incidental. It's not like they're trying to be the good guys. They're just trying to make more money. And if it happens to align with our interests, well, great, who cares? So I do want to ask, because something that Project Censored does is it has a very large focus on education in colleges and universities, and I'm reminded of the Powell memo, which talks not only about trying to get people with business interests inside media, but also inside of schools, because there were so many, when the Powell memo was written, there were so many uprisings at universities. So getting people that were pro-business, that were pro, the American enterprise model into the universities was a really powerful step. And so I'm wondering, like, not only what sort of roadblocks have you hit in that very pro-American enterprise university system, but also why so much importance on colleges and that particular portion?
Well, education, higher education, and particularly coming out of the early part of the 20th century with John Dewey and others, kind of really transformed the classroom into a laboratory to solve social problems and political problems and encourage civic engagement. And we've seen a return of that language, social justice language, civic engagement language, service learning language, except now it's been completely co-opted by big corporations that are privatizing education, as well as trying to mold public education into indoctrination centers for free market ideologies. And I say free market ideologies in quotes because we know that it's not really free, and it's certainly not fair. But I'm glad you brought up the Powell memo, because that's something that a lot of people people either have not heard of, don't remember. And this really is an important period of U.S. history coming out of the early 1970s. Lewis Powell, who's eventually on the Supreme Court, wrote this kind of manifesto or screed about how the 1960s were going the wrong way for elites, business people. We don't want students for democratic society. We don't need free speech movement. Too many of these people, these kids are growing up, they're going through college, and they're changing the institutions and taking control of them, and they want to actually teach free speech and teach free expression, and they want people to be civically engaged in society. And that means you're raising a generation of people that are going to question authority. And the business community and the chambers of commerce said, no, we need obedient workers and consumers. So we need to create our own sort of para-educational institutions and media. This also comes on the heels of the Nixon administration's attack on the press. Let's remember that Donald Trump did not invent the fake news meme or the attacks on the media. This is an old story. In fact, it goes way back, and it's not just people in the United States doing it. The press as enemy of the people, that goes back to Nazi Germany and Germany in World War I. That's an old propaganda tactic. And in fact, Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew, in a speech penned by the great writer William Safire, the nattering nabobs of negativism alliteration, that talked about how members of the press were a 4-H club, that they were hopeless, hysterical hypochondriacs of history. That was in the 70s, right when the Powell memo, right, was being written. And that's when the American Enterprise Institute was founded, and these other right-wing think tanks. And their purpose was to infiltrate not only the public sphere and the op-ed pages and the news media, but also education, endowed professorships, money that would flow into colleges, public universities, and private to do certain things, have a very pro-business slant. So it's interesting that at the same time that we saw the decrying of liberal education, liberal media from a lot of conservatives, they had no problem with the fact that capitalism and all this free market money was flowing into the education system to pump out pro-business, pro-Republican, really anti-public interest reactionaries that would become part of the public sphere, not just CEO culture, but in charge of regulatory agencies and regulatory capture. And they would also begin to be deans and administrators and chancellors at universities. And that's been a huge takeover of the public sector. Paulo Freire, Henry Giroux, I mentioned them earlier. People should seriously read this kind of research and read this kind of analysis to understand what's actually happening inside of academia. I hear it all the time living out in San Francisco. I hear it all the time about Berkeley liberals, Berkeley radicals. I lived in Berkeley for a long time, and I watched the university go further and further and further to the right. Do they have liberal or progressive professors there? Sure, to a degree. There's a Robert Reich. There's Ralph Nader's sister, Laura Nader. There's some people there for sure. But by and large, there's a very large Republican presence on campus, large student presence. And even though they have the history of the free speech movement, that's actually been hijacked by far right sort of hate speech provocateurs, who, by the way, have a right to speak, but that doesn't mean they automatically have a right to free public platforms. And that's created a lot of discord, and that's, again, being used against the left and against liberals in many cases, because it's not about debate. It's about sensationalism. And a true liberal education is about debate. It's about an exchange of ideas. It's not about control. It's not about railroading. And if you want to talk about conspiracies, what else is the Lewis Powell memo other than a conspiracy to shift to the right all of our public institutions? Here we are 40 some odd years later, and they've been resoundingly successful, in my estimation, at taking the Milton Friedman models, taking the models of the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institute, and they have captured a decent amount of academia. And with the help of big pharma, big ag, big sugar, all these corporations, big oil and energy, they have really swayed public debate, not only through education, but through ownership and advertising and shareholding and the use of elite sources through corporate media.
So I want to finally ask, because the idea of censorship versus non-inclusion, some people argue about the titles there, the verbiage. So it's not that people are censoring, like no one's saying that you can't say that. It's just that they don't include that in their stories. And so I'm interested to hear, like, why is it important to make sure that people understand that it's censorship. It's not just like, oh, oops, we forgot to put that in there. It's not omission. And what sort of censored stories do you have coming up on the docket for this coming year?
Um, well, Carl Jensen, when he founded Project Censored 41 years ago at Sonoma State University, and we're on about 20 campuses now. We work with a few hundred students and a few dozen faculty every year on this educational project. Our definitions for censorship have really not changed. We define censorship as anything that interferes with the free flow of information in a society that purports to have free press principles. This obviously includes things like purposeful omission, but it also includes framing. It includes sliding of content. And we write about this at the Global Critical Media Literacy Project, an offshoot of ours. We have a free educator's resource guide, by the way, for anybody out there in education or students who want to learn more about this kind of stuff, about the propaganda model, about media filters. We really want people to have those tools so that they can be their own agents of getting information and thinking independently and critically on their own. But it's really important to understand that censorship in its more prevalent forms is and more insidious forms is something that happens fairly regularly. And it happens more through framing and sliding of content or through spin. It's not necessarily the story that's totally ignored. It's the one that's poorly or inadequately or not factually covered. And then it leaves and posits this information in the public that lingers, that retractions and corrections can never really address fully. The old phrase that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. I'm not sure why the truth had its pants off, but uh, nevertheless, once it's out of the gate, the genie's out of the bottle. It's hard to maybe go back and fix that kind of thing. So at Project Censored, we really focus on not just the story you never heard of, but the story that some journalists somewhere really researched, really worked to publish, maybe risked their life or career to do so, and their story stands the test of time. Gary Webb comes to mind in the crack cocaine explosion in the 1980s that he covered in the 1990s that he lost his job for at the San Jose Mercury News. So many others. And we highlight those journalists, those intrepid journalists every year in our top 25. We research hundreds of stories a year. And we're saying there are people that are doing real journalism. There are people that are opposed to censorship. These are people that are arguing for inclusion. They want you to be able to see these stories. They want you to be able to think critically about these stories and then come to your own conclusion about what they mean. But I think, too, what we also see is we see kind of a hijacking of some of these free speech, free press issues, where some people then interpret that as being able to say anything you want, anywhere you want, anytime you want, without any consequences. That's never been true of the First Amendment or First Amendment protections. Libel and slander are not protected. And even though intellectually we could argue there are problems with hate speech in terms of, well, what is it and who wields it and how does it work? I think that it's really important to know that it's also not protected to incite violence, right? And it's really important that we don't make a joke out of free speech, and we don't make a joke or make light of these viewpoints. We see a lot of rebranding of fascist, neo-fascist ideas as new nationalism or these types of things, and this dog whistle politics. What the real reason we need free speech and free press is to call out what that kind of dog whistle politics is. And by the way, we also need to call out that kind of authoritarian tendency where it might lie on the left, right? Where it can be used as a cudgel to bludgeon anyone that wants to have any critical commentary about how these issues are shaping pedagogy. Again, our position may be quite nuanced and complicated to some, but at Project Censored, we're simply in favor of a free press. We're in favor of free speech. We work with groups like the National Coalition Against Censorship. We're sponsors of Banned Books Week. We work with artists and others that against censorship. And we've really tried to make sure that that's our focus. And if you go back and look at the former FCC commissioner, Nick Johnson, he wrote a foreword for our book a couple years ago. Nick Johnson wrote a really important book a number of years ago called Your Second Priority. And what he said was no matter what your first area of interest is, whether, maybe it's justice in Palestine, or maybe, like you mentioned earlier, like GMOs or food security, or maybe it's war and peace, or, maybe it's tax justice. I mean, whatever your area of interest is that you think is important, environmental science, climate change, global warming. Nick Johnson said that if your second priority isn't media freedom, press freedom, and reforms, you're likely going to gain very little traction in your first area of interest. And we see that happening. Look at what happened with Black Lives Matter. Look at how it gets thrown under the bus. Look at how it gets victimized. Look at how it gets literally turned into a problem instead of a solution. And then people say, well, all lives matter, blue lives matter, whatever the hell that is. That's absolutely preposterous propaganda. But again, look at what's happening. We see a shooting of the messengers. The press should never be the shooter of the messenger. The press should be the messenger, and it should be as objective as possible. However, given that we can't be objective, they should be very transparent, right, about what the angle is, what the interests are, why they're saying the things that they're saying, and why they won't look at other perspectives. The second part of that is the real problem. If we had a free press, we wouldn't have to be waiting to hear from other perspectives. They would already be there. We're not waiting at Project Censor for the corporate media to show us those perspectives. We go out and find them. We republish them every year. We have them on the radio show. And again, we know that, again, people like you that do the work you do, Eleanor Lee Camp, other people, Abby Martin, Manar Mahawish. There are so many people that do really solid work in journalism. Rania Khalek, Kevin Gostola. I mean, we go on and on and on. There are actual people doing real journalism here. But unfortunately, they don't have the platform of the corporate media, and we need to help kind of create our own networks and our own platforms to get in a post-truth world, to get the facts to the public so they can make their decisions and determinations more wisely, more judiciously, and then act on them in the public sphere. As far as some of the stories we have under development, you can go to projectcensored.org. And you can see what some of our newest validated independent news stories are. We call our research stories validated independent news stories because A, they're independent alternative stories. They're not corporate. They're validated because they go through a research project where students go through university college databases to see if they have corporate coverage, and if so, what kind. They're part of classes that have a curriculum of critical media literacy pedagogy that have information veracity checklists, teach people what are facts versus fictions, facts versus opinions. So they go through these processes with professors, with community members, people that are experts in the fields the stories are about, and then we post them on the web. Most recently, we have stories, one on Puerto Rican students organizing national strikes to demand transparency in response to austerity measures after the catastrophe there. There's a story on animal activists and how they, basically, have to conceal their identity because of AETA, American Enterprise Terrorism Act, and all these other bizarre laws that are designed to stifle activists that are against factory farming. How about that the FBI has been racially profiling Black identity extremists? Fred Hampton, it was just been the anniversary of his killing. We're talking half a century of racial profiling. The FBI was profiling Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. This is almost a century of this kind of behavior, but yet here it continues to happen, and yet no one's talking about how the FBI is racially profiling African-American activists and racial social justice activists. And in fact, the FBI is calling them Black identity extremists. What kind of world is it in the 21st century in the United States where we actually are calling people that are fighting for social justice and equality, quote, extremists? Mm-hmm. Well, that shows you how far to the right we've shifted. And I guess Lewis Powell and many of the reactionary supporters of the notion that came out of the 70s would be quite pleased with Donald Trump's America.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, when people say, oh, you're a radical, I'm like, well, if it's radical to want, racial equality, gender equality, clean air, clean water, clean food, then yeah, fuck, I'm absolutely a radical.
Yeah, sign me up. I'm pretty radical. And remember, the great irony, too, is that radical simply means going to the root, right? And if we do want to go to the root, let's go back to December 15th of 1791, when a bunch of imperfect, partially slave-owning white male patriarchs actually demanded that we add the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution. And therein has been one of the more influential governing documents around the world that also influenced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 at the United Nations, which I encourage all people to really go and not just read, but really internalize and think, what does this mean? And how far away from this are we? in the 21st century and in the place like the United States. So again, I not just appreciate being able to have this conversation with you. I really appreciate the work you do and the work that you do through your arts, through creativity, and just leading not just by example, but it's a contagious and spontaneous thing, right? I think it's really important that we highlight more and more people that are doing these kind of things, because I know one of the biggest enemies we face, those of us who radically seek social justice and so forth, not as social justice warriors, as the right calls, but fairness and equity, right? That's what I'm referring to. Those of us that seek that can get siloed and feel really lonely and demoralized. And I know when people read the censored stories every year, they're just like, oh, this is terrible. I can't handle this. So we do try to include good news, positive stories, because guess what? We're not alone. There are millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people in the United States and across the world that really are working on these same issues. And that's why it's important to build these networks. The corporations built their networks. The CIA has their networks. Global governments have their networks. The 1% have the 0.0001 Davos set have their economic networks. We need to have our networks too. And that's also why net neutrality is so important, is to be able to use these information technologies for our own benefit and for the benefit of the public at large, and to act in the public interest.